In 1983, a company buried 14 truckloads of video game cartridges in the New Mexico desert in the middle of the night and covered them with concrete so nobody would ever find them. They did not want anyone to know what they had done. They did not want anyone to see the evidence of how badly things had gone wrong. For years, people thought this was just an urban legend, a story too strange and too embarrassing to be real. But in 2014, excavators went into that desert and dug it all up. The cartridges were real. The burial was real, and the story behind why one of the most powerful technology companies in American history ended up dumping millions of dollars worth of product into a hole in the ground is one of the most jaw-dropping collapses in the history of business. This is not just a story about video games. This is a story about genius and greed and speed, and what happens when the people who build something incredible hand it over to people who understand nothing about why it was incredible in the first place. This is the story of Atari, and if you think you already know it, you do not know the half it. Before Atari, there were no video games in the home. That sentence sounds simple, but sit with it for a moment. There was no such thing as playing a game on a screen inside your own house. The idea did not exist as a commercial reality for ordinary people. Arcades had machines, but they were enormous and expensive and bolted to the floor. Nolan Bushnell was a young engineer with a background in Carnival Midway Games, who believed that the experience of playing something interactive on a screen could be brought into the living room. In 1972, he co-founded Atari with Steve Bristow and a few others, and their first product was Pong, a simple two-paddle tennis game with a bouncing dot. By modern standards, it sounds laughably basic, but in 1972 it was like showing fire to someone who had never seen warmth. People stood in lines to play it. Bars that installed the arcade cabinet reported that customers stayed longer and spent more money just to keep playing. The machine was so popular that the first unit Atari installed in a local bar broke down within 2 weeks because the coin box was so completely stuffed with quarters that it jammed the mechanism. That was the first sign this was not a novelty. This was something people genuinely could not stop doing. He was a visionary with the energy of someone who could see 5 years ahead and the impatience of someone who wanted to be there already. Atari expanded quickly into home consoles, and in 1977 they released the Atari 2600. This was the machine that changed everything. It used interchangeable cartridges, which meant it was not just one game but a platform for infinite games. You could play Space Invaders one day and Adventure the next, and Pitfall the day after that. The living room had become an arcade. Parents were buying it, kids were begging for it, and the sales numbers reflected a level of demand that the industry had never seen before. By the late 1970s, Atari was the fastest-growing company in American history. Not the fastest-growing toy company, not the fastest-growing tech company, the fastest-growing company in America. In 1980 alone, over $2 billion in revenue, which at the time was a number so large that most people in the industry simply could not process it. Bushnell had taken an idea about a bouncing dot on a screen and turned it into a culture, and then turned that culture into an empire. But here is where the story takes its first dark turn, because Bushnell was not there to see it. In 1976, before the 2600 even launched, Bushnell sold Atari to Warner Communications for $28 million. He needed the capital to scale, and Warner had the money. But what Warner also had was a corporate structure, and a corporate mindset, and a corporate way of thinking about products that was completely alien to everything Atari had been built on. Bushnell himself was pushed out of the company in 1978, just 1 year after the 2600 launched. The man who invented the entire category was gone before he could see what his invention became. And the people Warner installed to run Atari were not engineers or game designers or creative visionaries. They were business executives who looked at spreadsheets and saw dollar signs and believed that the machine printing money would simply keep printing it forever, as long as they kept feeding it paper. They did not understand that what made Atari special was not the hardware. It was the creativity. It was the culture. It was the completely insane collection of brilliant misfits who were designing games in a company that felt more like a rock band than a corporation. And Warner was about to find out what happens when you treat artists like assembly line workers. The game designers at Atari were some of the most talented programmers of their generation. They were doing things with the 2600 hardware that the engineers who built a machine thought were literally impossible. A programmer named Warren Robinett secretly coded his own name into the game Adventure, creating the first ever Easter egg in video game history, partly as a hidden protest because Atari refused to put designer credits on any games. The company treated its creators as anonymous factory workers producing interchangeable widgets. There were no royalties, no recognition, no creative ownership, just salaries and a policy of secrecy so strict that designers were not even allowed to tell people outside the company what they did for a living. In 1979, 4 of Atari's top designers walked out and formed their own company. They called it Activision, and they announced to the world that they were the people who had made the games everyone loved, and now they were going to make better ones independently. Atari sued them, they lost, and the floodgates opened. If Activision could do it, anyone could. And soon anyone did. This is the moment the empire began to crack, because what Atari had accidentally built was not just a console. They had built an open platform with no quality control. The market was flooded almost overnight. Hundreds of companies started producing cartridges. Most of them were terrible. Genuinely shockingly bad games rushed to market by companies that had no idea what they were doing, but saw an opportunity to make money off the Atari name. The shelves of toy stores and electronics shops went from carrying a curated selection of solid games to being buried under an avalanche of garbage. Started buying games and taking them home only to discover they were unplayable. Trust eroded, returns piled up, and retailers who had been enthusiastic partners started pulling back their orders because the ratio of bad product to good product was becoming impossible to manage. The market was cannibalizing itself. But even with all of this happening, Atari's executives were not worried, because in 1982 they had secured the deal they believed would save everything. The Atari 2600 port of Pac-Man was supposed to be the biggest moment in the company's history. Pac-Man was the most popular arcade game on Earth. Every child in America knew it. Every parent had watched their kid pour quarters into the machine. Licensing it for the home console was considered a guaranteed home run. Atari ordered 12 million cartridges produced. There were only 10 million 2600 consoles in existence at the time, which means they were producing more copies of the game than there were machines to play it on. The confidence was absolute. But the game that shipped was a disaster. The developers were given 5 weeks onto hardware that was not built for it. The ghosts did not behave correctly. The visuals were a pale shadow of the arcade version. The signature sound effects were wrong, and the gameplay felt broken in a way that was immediately obvious to anyone who had ever played the real thing. 4 million copies were returned. Unsold inventory piled up in warehouses, and then came E.T. the Extraterrestrial. If Pac-Man was the warning, then E.T. was the catastrophe. Steven Spielberg's film was the biggest movie of 1982, and Atari paid $25 million believing the brand alone would sell the game. The developer was given 5 weeks to build it from scratch. 5 weeks to create a game that was supposed to carry the entire company through the holiday season. What shipped was widely considered then and now to be one of the worst video games ever made. Players fell into pits they could not escape. The objective was unclear. The controls were frustrating. Critics and consumers reacted with genuine anger. Millions of cartridges went unsold, and the combination of Pac-Man and E.T., and the flood of third-party garbage, and the collapse of consumer trust created something the industry had never seen before. The video game crash of 1983. An event so severe the entire American video game industry permanently. Atari's revenue fell from $2 billion to just $100 million in 2 years. Warner sold the company off in pieces. The home computing division went one way. The console and game business went another. And somewhere in the New Mexico desert, 14 truckloads of evidence were being lowered into the ground. The Atari story so devastating is not that they failed. Plenty of companies fail. What makes it devastating is that they had everything. They had the technology. They had the audience. They had the loyalty. They had some of the most talented creative minds of their generation working inside their walls. And they threw it away. Not because the world stopped wanting what they made, but because the people running the company stopped respecting the thing that made it worth wanting. They treated creativity like a production line. They treated their best designers like nameless workers and watched them walk out the door and build a competitor. They chased a license instead of investing in quality. They flooded a market that needed curation. Every single decision that destroyed Atari was made not by outsiders or bad luck, but by insiders who chose short-term money over long-term trust. And when the trust was gone, the money followed it right out the door. Nintendo would arrive in America in 1985 and rebuild the home gaming market from the ground up with strict quality control and a licensing system that prevented the flood of bad games that had broken Atari. They learned directly from Atari's mistakes. They built the thing Atari refused to protect, And today, the video game industry generates more revenue annually than Hollywood and the music industry combined. The empire Atari could have ruled forever is now the biggest entertainment category on Earth. They just are not in it anymore. What they built in that small office in Sunnyvale, California, in 1972 with a bouncing dot on a screen changed everything about how human beings spend their time, and their attention, and their imagination. They just forgot that the people who make things feel magical deserve to be treated like the source of the magic. The moment they forgot that the magic left, and all that remained was 14 truckloads of cartridges in a hole in the desert, and a lesson that the entire industry has been learning from ever since.